Welcome to the Lion's Share podcast, where we break down today's most impactful research and bring fresh insights from the academic frontier straight to you.
Today, we're tackling one of the most critical and, let's be honest, complex interfaces in finance and law.
Absolutely. We're talking about how large institutional investors actually hold corporations accountable.
Right, especially when those quiet, behind-the-scenes conversations, the private demands, just don't work anymore.
We are focusing on that moment when the threat of legal action becomes very real, when those private monitoring channels dry up.
And the only option left is that costly, very public mechanism, securities, class action litigation.
Exactly. And the fundamental question for every practitioner scholar in this space, the question we're diving into today is, does this legal stick actually work?
Does it really deliver corporate discipline? And maybe more importantly, does it bring about genuine, lasting governance reform?
Especially when the big players, the large institutional investors, step up and take the lead plaintiff role.
Absolutely. And to answer that, we're doing a deep dive into a really foundational paper on this. It's the 2010 study, Institutional Monitoring Through Shareholder Litigation.
Authored by Cheng, Huang, and Lobo. It's really well regarded for its rigorous methodology.
It directly tests the policy goals of that big piece of legislation, the Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995, the PSLRA.
Yeah, the PSLRA. Our mission today, and this is tailored specifically for you, the practitioner scholar looking for that rapid, high-impact knowledge.
Our mission is to really unpack the methodology, the econometric choices, and frankly, the massive economic findings of this work.
We'll start with a summary, frame why it matters, define some key terms.
And then we'll tackle 6 critical research questions. We'll look at the theory, the design, the econometrics, the results, and ultimately the conclusions.
And whether those conclusions really hold water.
Exactly. That roadmap should ensure we cover the rigorous details that give these findings their real power. Okay, let's start with the core summary. Just lay it out clearly. What was the central question Cheng and colleagues were trying to answer?
Well, their core research question was really focused. It was essentially, did the PSLRA actually achieve its goal?
Which
was getting sophisticated institutional owners involved as lead plaintiffs instead of just individuals, and whether that actually leads to better outcomes.
Okay, better outcomes in what sense?
They looked at 2 main things. First, the immediate litigation results, like, is the case less likely to be discussed? Is the settlement amount bigger?
Right.
And second, something arguably more important in the long run. Does having an institution lead the case actually force the company to improve its corporate governance afterwards?
And how do they go about answering that? It sounds like a tough causality nut to crack.
Oh, it absolutely is. The methods were pretty robust. They had to use some fairly complex econometrics, mainly to deal with the huge issue of self-selection bias.
We'll definitely come back to that.
For sure. They analyzed a big sample, 1,811 securities lawsuits filed after the PSLRA kicked in between 1996 and 2005.
So a consistent legal environment.
Exactly. And they used different statistical models depending on what they were measuring. Probit models for yes-no things like dismissal. OLS regressions for continuous things like settlement size.
Log, I assume, given how skewed settlement amounts can be.
You got it. Log settlements. And they even used hazard models to look at how long it took to reach a settlement.
Okay. But the key was controlling for why an institution might pick a case in the first place.
That was the real innovation, yes. They threw in a ton of control variables to account for the reasons an institution might choose one case over another case, merit, potential damages, things like that.
Right. So after all that rigorous work, what was the payoff? What were the key findings?
The findings were pretty clear-cut and honestly quite significant. When an institutional investor was the lead plaintiff compared to an individual, 3 main things stood out. 1, a significantly lower chance the case would just be dismissed outright.
Okay, that's big.
2, significantly larger monetary settlements, and we're talking economically massive differences here. And 3, evidence of greater improvement in board independence at the company after the lawsuit.
So the contribution here seems pretty profound then.
It really is. It provides solid, systematic, empirical evidence that securities litigation isn't just, lining lawyers' pockets, as some critics claimed.
It's actually a viable and seemingly effective disciplining tool when these big institutional owners wield it.
Exactly. It basically validates the core intention behind the PSLRA.
Which brings us right to the managerial relevance. What are the takeaways for practitioners, for executives, board members, IR teams?
The absolute crucial lesson here is Not all plaintiffs are the same. Far from it. Meaning, the moment an institution, especially a big public pension fund, decides to step up and become the lead plaintiff,
the whole game changes.
The entire risk profile shifts dramatically. It's no longer just about potentially writing a check to make it go away.
It becomes a systemic challenge.
Precisely. It transforms from what might have been seen as a sort of manageable cash-out event into a much deeper corporate challenge. The firm needs to brace itself not just for a bigger financial hit, but potentially for demands to change how it's governed.
That has immediate knock-on effects for strategy, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It impacts your litigation strategy, how you negotiate, and critically, it impacts directors and officers' D&O liability insurance.
How so on the D&O front?
Well, firms facing an institutional lead plaintiff have to anticipate much larger potential payouts and these structural reform demands. That changes the negotiation calculus.
And the insurers see that increased risk.
Exactly. The cost and potentially the availability or coverage limits of D&O insurance can change. The insurer's view of this systemic risk goes way up when they see CalPERS or a similar fund leading the charge, because suddenly the chance of dismissal drops and the potential settlement skyrockets.
Okay, before we dive deeper into the methodology and those results, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with some key terms. The legal and governance context here is vital.
Good idea.
Let's start with the catalyst for all this. The Private Securities Litigation Reform Act of 1995, the PSLRA.
Right, the PSLRA. It was a landmark piece of legislation. The main driver behind it was a concern about so-called strike suits.
These were seen as lawsuits driven more by lawyers than by actual aggrieved investors.
Pretty much. The perception was that lawyers would find someone with a few shares, file a weak lawsuit, and pressure the company into a quick settlement just to get their fees, often leaving the actual shareholders with very little.
So the PSLRA tried to shift the power.
Exactly. It aimed to put the investors, specifically the largest investors, in the driver's seat.
And how did it do that specifically?
The key provision for our discussion is the requirement that the court appoints as lead plaintiff the party or group that has the largest financial stake in the outcome of the litigation.
The idea being that those with the most skin in the game would fight harder.
That was the explicit goal. Congress wanted to encourage these large, sophisticated institutional investors who naturally had the biggest stakes to step up and take control of the litigation process.
Okay, so that leads us to the concept of lead plaintiff status itself.
Yeah.
What powers does that role actually confer?
Oh, it confers significant power. The lead plaintiff essentially acts on behalf of the entire class of shareholders.
So they make the key decisions.
They do. They oversee the whole litigation strategy. Crucially, they choose the lawyers, the class counsel. They monitor those lawyers. They can even fire them. And ultimately, they have to approve any settlement offer. They have a fiduciary duty to all the class members.
And the rationale for giving this power to the largest stakeholder flows from that largest stake idea, right? The legal presumption.
Yes. The legal assumption or presumption is that the entity with the largest financial interest is best positioned and most motivated to act in the best interests of all shareholders.
It's designed to combat the classic free rider problem.
Exactly. If you only own a few shares, the cost and effort of closely monitoring the lawyers and pushing for the absolute best outcome probably isn't worth your pro rata share of any marginal increase in the settlement.
But if you're an institution with millions at stake,
then the potential benefit of getting a better settlement or ensuring the lawyers don't take excessive fees suddenly makes the cost of that monitoring worthwhile.
Let's talk about those fees and potential suboptimal outcomes. This brings us to litigation agency costs. You unpack that a bit. It's a critical concept for anyone on a board or in the C-suite.
Definitely. Think of agency costs here as the gap between what's best for the shareholders, the principals, and what might be best for the class action lawyers, the agents.
The lawyers want to get paid, ideally quickly.
Right. The shareholders, the class members, want the maximum possible recovery, even if it takes longer and involves more risk. The lawyers, however, might prefer a smaller but faster settlement because their fee is a percentage of that settlement, and getting paid sooner is often better from their perspective.
So the agency cost is that difference. The value lost because the lawyer settles too early or too cheaply.
Precisely. It's the suboptimal outcome driven by that misalignment of incentives. It could also include excessively high legal fees cutting into the shareholders' recovery.
And the theory is that institutions can reduce these costs. This is the institutional mitigation idea.
Yes. Institutions, because of their large stakes, have a powerful incentive to watch the lawyers closely. They also have the resources, in-house legal teams, financial analysts, and the sophistication to actually do that monitoring effectively.
So they can push back against a quick, low-ball settlement offer.
They can, and they can negotiate harder on the lawyer's fees. They're better equipped to ensure the litigation serves the class members' interests, not just the lawyers.
Okay, one last key term: board independence. The paper uses this as a measure of long-term success. How exactly did Cheng et al. Measure it?
Board independence is their key proxy for whether the lawsuit forced real structural governance reform. They measured it using a few standard metrics.
Such as?
Primarily, the percentage of independent directors on the full board. They also looked at the independence of the crucially important audit committee and whether the board had a designated lead independent director.
And why is board independence seen as such a critical indicator of good governance, the governance link?
It goes back to fundamental agency theory, work by people like Schleifer and Vishny. An independent board, one not dominated by insiders or allies of the CEO, is thought to be better positioned to monitor management effectively.
To prevent management from acting in its own interest rather than the shareholders.
Exactly. So when an institution pushes for greater board independence after a lawsuit, they're not just ticking a box. They're demanding a structural change they believe will reduce the risk of future misconduct, the kind that led to the lawsuit in the first place. It's seen as a long-term safeguard for shareholder value.
All right, let's shift gears now and start tackling our 6 key questions about the paper itself. Starting with question 1. Let's just formally restate the core research focus and really drill down on why this question was so important, particularly in that post-PSLRA world.
Okay. The fundamental question, boiled down, is this. When institutions step into that lead plaintiff role mandated by the PSLRA, are they genuinely more effective monitors than the individual plaintiffs they replaced?
And effective in those 2 ways we discussed.
Yes. Effective, both in terms of the immediate lawsuit outcomes, getting cases resolved favorably, meaning lower dismissal rates and higher settlements, and in terms of driving subsequent tangible improvements in corporate governance.
So why was answering that specific question so critical at the time? What gap was it filling?
Well, it goes back to the context of the agency problem and perceived monitoring deficits. Before this paper, and around that time, there was actually a lot of academic skepticism about how effectively large institutions could really monitor corporations.
Even though they owned huge chunks of the market.
Right, because the traditional tools seemed, well, a bit weak. Trying to negotiate privately with management could often just ignore them.
What about shareholder proposals? Proxy fights?
Often ineffective. Proposals were frequently non-binding, or they'd fail to get enough votes. Karpoff's work, for example, suggested these private channels were often quite toothless. Institutions needed something with more bite.
And litigation provides that bite, the credible threat.
That's the theory. Litigation is the big stick. As Dennis pointed out, getting hit with a major securities class action imposes huge costs, financial penalties, yes, but also massive reputational damage, management time distraction.
So it's a threat management has to take seriously.
Absolutely. It's a powerful public channel for discipline when those private channels fail. So the literature really needed to know, could institutions actually wield this stick effectively? Was it a genuine tool for reform or just another costly exercise?
So the study isn't just academic navel-gazing. It's effectively grading a major piece of legislation. It's the PSLRA test.
That's a great way to put it. Its importance lies squarely in testing whether the central premise of the PSLRA empowering institutions to improve monitoring governance actually worked in practice.
Because if institutions took the lead role but didn't actually achieve better results,
then the law might have failed in its core objective. It might have just shifted the lead plaintiff title without changing the underlying dynamics. Cheng and colleagues stepped in to provide the rigorous empirical verdict on whether the act succeeded in replacing passive, potentially lawyer-captured plaintiffs with sophisticated, motivated monitors who delivered better outcomes.
Okay, moving on to the theoretical foundations. Good research doesn't just look at what happens, but why. So, question 2. What theories did the authors lean on to build their hypotheses? Why did they expect institutional plaintiffs to be more effective?
The first major theoretical hurdle they needed to address is the free rider problem. This comes from classic work by people like Romano and Grossman and Hart.
Remind us of the core issue there in this context.
Well, think about a large pension fund. They might hold shares in hundreds, maybe thousands of companies, even if they have a big stake in one particular company facing a lawsuit, say $50 million worth.
That's still potentially a tiny fraction of their total assets under management.
Exactly. So the theory asks, Why would they spend, say, $1 million actively monitoring the lawyers and pushing hard in this one specific case when they'll still get their pro rata share of the settlement if someone else does the hard work? It's cheaper to just ride for free.
So how do the authors argue institutions overcome this?
They argue it comes down to a few key things, primarily scale and efficiency. First, while their percentage stake might be small relative to their total portfolio, the absolute dollar amount they have at risk in a major lawsuit is often enormous, much larger than any individual investor's stake.
So the potential dollar gain from a better outcome justifies the monitoring cost.
That's the argument. The potential return from, say, a 10% higher settlement or preventing future losses through governance reform is large enough in absolute dollar terms to make the monitoring effort rational for them, even if it wouldn't be for a small shareholder.
And the efficiency point.
They also argue institutions have lower marginal monitoring costs. They already have sophisticated in-house legal teams, governance experts, analysts.
It's part of their day job, essentially.
Right, so the additional cost for them to actively oversee one more lawsuit is relatively lower compared to an individual or a group of individuals who'd have to hire experts from scratch.
Okay, so the economics of their large stake and existing infrastructure helps overcome the free rider issue for the immediate lawsuit. But why push for governance reform? Why not just maximize the cash settlement and move on?
That brings us to the second key theoretical pillar, the incentive structure beyond immediate settlement. This is particularly relevant for certain types of institutions.
Like who?
Think about large index funds or huge pension funds. They often face practical constraints on selling large blocks of stock quickly without moving the market or deviating from their index mandate.
So they're essentially locked in as long-term holders, whether they like it or not.
To a large extent, yes. Gillen and Starks talked about this. Because they're stuck holding the stock long-term, their incentives shift. They care deeply about the future health and performance of the company.
So fixing the governance problems that led to the lawsuit becomes really important to them.
Exactly. It's not just about getting compensated for past losses. It's about preventing future losses. Investing in better governance, like a more independent board, is a way to mitigate future risk and protect the long-term value of their very large ongoing investment.
Now, you mentioned earlier that public pension funds often get the biggest settlements. Does that suggest another layer of motivation, maybe beyond pure financial optimization?
It certainly does, and the authors acknowledge this. This ties into theories around spillover and political benefits.
What do you mean by that?
Well, public pension funds, like CalPERS or state retirement systems, operate in a very public and often political environment. Wojtek's research suggested that being seen as aggressive champions for shareholder rights, taking on misbehaving corporations...
That plays well publicly, generates good PR.
It can, yes. It helps trustees demonstrate they're fulfilling their fiduciary duties, it can generate positive press, and it might even have broader spillover benefits if improving governance at one company sets a precedent or standard that benefits their entire portfolio.
But wait, let's push on that slightly. If the study found that other institutions, like union funds or mutual funds, also significantly outperformed individuals on things like dismissal rates and governance improvements, doesn't that suggest the core driver isn't just politics, that maybe focusing too much on the political angle for public funds misses the bigger picture?
That's a really important clarification, you're right. While the political benefits theory might help explain why public funds push for the absolute largest dollar settlements, maybe even spending disproportionately to get them passed, the fact that the monitoring effectiveness, lower dismissals, better governance is seen across different institutional types.
Like unions, mutual funds.
It suggests the fundamental driver is the institutional capacity itself. It's the resources, the expertise, the large stake creating the incentive to monitor rigorously. That seems to be the common thread, even if political factors add an extra layer of motivation for some public funds.
Okay, we've got the theory down. Now let's really dig into the mechanics of the study. For our audience of practitioner scholars, question 3 is absolutely crucial. How did the research design tackle the big challenges of validity, non-random assignment, and especially exogeneity? This is where we assess the study's credibility.
Right, this is the show me the rigor part. Let's start with the basic research design overview. As we said, they used 1,811 lawsuits filed between 1996 and 2005. That post-PSLRA window is key for a consistent legal environment.
And they focused on cases that were resolved by mid-2006.
Yes, either dismissed or settled, so they had complete outcome data for their main analyses. In terms of construct validity, their measures seem pretty solid and well aligned with the theory.
Meaning the variables measure what they're supposed to measure.
Exactly. The main treatment variable is D on lead, a simple dummy variable. 1 if an institution is the lead plaintiff, 0 otherwise. The outcomes are direct measures, dismissal, settlement amount, settlement, and those governance changes we discussed. Seems straightforward and valid.
Okay, but now the elephant in the room. Internal validity and that self-selection problem. How do we know institutions get better outcomes because they monitor better, and not just because they pick better cases to begin with?
That is the absolute core endogeneity challenge. Institutions are smart, they have analysts, they're not going to waste their resources leading a frivolous lawsuit. They will naturally self-select into cases that appear to have stronger merits, clearer evidence of fraud, and larger potential damages.
So a simple comparison between institution-led cases and individual-led cases would be misleading.
Totally misleading. You'd find institutions have better outcomes, but you couldn't say if it was because of their active monitoring or just because they started with stronger cases. The DLE variable isn't randomly assigned, it's endogenous.
So how did Cheng et al. Try to tackle this? How did they control for that self-selection?
They did it primarily by building a detailed model of the determinants of why an institution would choose to become a lead plaintiff in the first place. They included a whole battery of control variables in their main regression models. This is laid out in their Table 2 analysis.
What kinds of variables? Give us some examples.
They controlled for proxies of case merit and potential damages. Things like, was there an alleged gap violation? Was a major accounting firm also sued? ACCTG FAR. These suggest a more serious, potentially easier to prove case.
Okay, what else?
They looked at the scale of the alleged misconduct. How long was the class period? LCI says. A longer period might mean more extensive fraud. And what was the market reaction when the bad news came out? CAR3. A huge stock drop suggests investors perceived major damage. They also included the estimated potential investor loss, LGPO.
Makes sense. Did they also control for factors related to the institution's own interests?
Yes, factors indicating the importance to the institution, like the size of the defendant firm, LOGMV, bigger firms, might attract more attention. And critically, the level of institutional share ownership before the lawsuit, in share. Institutions are more likely to lead cases where they already have significant holdings.
So the logic is, by statistically controlling for all these reasons why an institution might pick a case,
any remaining statistically significant effect found for the Deng-led variable should, theoretically, represent the incremental impact of the institution's active monitoring and litigation efforts, above and beyond the inherent quality of the case they selected.
It's an attempt to isolate the treatment effect.
Exactly. It's the standard approach when you can't do a randomized controlled trial, which is impossible here.
Okay, one more validity point. External validity, especially for the governance findings. How did they make sure the improvements they saw, like that 11% jump in board independence, weren't just due to broader market trends? Sarbanes-Oxley happened during their sample period, for instance.
That's a critical question. And they addressed it quite cleverly. For the governance analysis, hypothesis 2, they didn't just look at the sued firms in isolation, they constructed a control group.
How?
They used firms from the Investor Responsibility Research Center, IRC database, which tracks governance data that were comparable in terms of industry and size, but were not sued during the same period.
A matched comparison group.
Precisely. They then calculated the change in board independence for the institution-led defendant firms relative to the average change experienced by the non-sued control firms over the same time frame.
So it's a difference in differences kind of idea.
Conceptually, yes. By comparing the change in the treated group, institution-led sued firms, to the change in the control group, non-sued firms, they effectively filter out the impact of any market-wide changes, like new regulations or listing standards. That makes the finding that institution-led firms improved independence by 11.7% more than the control group much more convincing as an effect of the lawsuit itself.
Right, let's get into the statistical toolkit itself now. Question 4. What specific econometric methods did they use? And how did these methods help address the design weaknesses, particularly that nagging endogeneity issue? This is where the quantitative rigor really shows.
Okay, for the immediate outcomes, dismissal and settlement, the choice of method was driven by the nature of the dependent variable.
Makes sense.
For predicting dismissal, hypothesis 1A, the outcome is binary. The case is either dismissed 1 or not. 0. So they used a probit regression.
Why probit instead of, say, a simple linear probability model using OLS?
Good question. OLS on a binary outcome has problems. It can predict probabilities outside the logical 0 to 1 range, and the error terms violate OLS assumptions. Probit, or logit models, are specifically designed for binary outcomes. They estimate the probability of the event occurring, constrained between 0 and 1, based on the independent variables. It's the statistically appropriate tool here.
Got it. And for the settlement amount, hypothesis 1B,
there, the outcome is continuous, the dollar amount of the settlement, so they use standard OLS regression. But, as we mentioned, settlement amounts are usually very skewed. Lots of smaller settlements, a few huge ones.
so they use the logarithm of the settlement amount.
Exactly. They use the natural log of the total or cash settlement amount as the dependent variable. Taking the log helps normalize the distribution, making the OLS assumptions more likely to hold and yielding more reliable estimates.
And critically, in both the Probit and OLS models, they included all those control variables we just discussed, the determinants of self-selection.
Absolutely crucial. Including those controlled was their first line of defense against the bias caused by institutions picking better cases. The goal was to ensure the coefficient on D and lead captured the incremental effect of having an institution in charge, net of case characteristics.
But even with all those controls, there's always the worry about unobserved factors driving both selection and outcome, right? That residual heterogeneity.
Precisely. There might still be some unmeasurable aspect of case quality or lawyer skill that influences both whether an institution takes the case and the final outcome. Simple controls might not capture everything.
So they went a step further.
They did. To really nail down the causality and address this potential remaining bias, they employed a two-stage approach. Depending on the model, this involved either a two-stage Probit estimation or, more commonly known, two-stage least squares, 2SLS.
Okay, 2SLS requires an instrumental variable, doesn't it? Something that affects the potentially endogenous variable, D in the slate, but not the final outcome directly.
Exactly. Finding a valid instrumental variable is the key and often the hardest part of this technique. The AVI needs to satisfy two conditions. Relevance, it's strongly correlated with the endogenous variable EGED, and the exclusion restriction. It affects the outcome only through its effect on the endogenous variable, not directly.
So what do they use as their instrument?
They use the 3-day cumulative abnormal stock return, CAR3, around the announcement of the alleged fraud or misconduct that triggered the lawsuit.
Okay, let's unpack that. Why is CAR3 a plausible instrument? First, relevance. Why would the stock drop predict whether an institution leads the case?
That part's fairly intuitive. A larger negative CAR3 indicates a bigger immediate financial loss for shareholders. This larger loss provides a stronger incentive for an institution, with its potentially large holdings, to step in and try to recover those damages. So CAR3 should be strongly correlated with DAI3.
Okay, relevance seems plausible. Now the trickier part, the exclusion restriction. How can we be sure that CAR3, the initial market reaction, doesn't directly influence the judge's decision later on whether to dismiss the case, independent of who the lead plaintiff is?
That's the crucial argument they have to make. The idea is that CAR3 reflects the market's initial assessment of the damage. However, when a judge reviews a motion to dismiss, they're supposed to apply legal standards based on the pleadings. Does the complaint meet the PSLRA's requirements for specificity? Does it state a valid legal claim?
The argument being the initial stock price reaction isn't part of that legal test.
Exactly. The judge shouldn't dismiss a case simply because the stock drop was small, or refuse to dismiss it just because the drop was huge. The legal merits are separate. So the argument is that CAR3 influences the outcome dismissal only indirectly by influencing the probability that a motivated institution takes the lead. If you accept that argument, CAR3 is a valid instrument.
And using this 2SLS approach allows them to get a potentially less biased estimate of the true causal effect of DILAT.
That's the goal. It's considered a more rigorous way to handle endogeneity than just relying on control variables alone. The fact that their main results held up under this tougher specification adds a lot of weight to their conclusions.
Okay, one last method, the time factor.
Yeah.
You mentioned hazard models. Why use those for analyzing the time it takes to settle?
Right. They use the Cox proportional hazard model. Standard OLS isn't suitable for analyzing duration data like time to settlement for a couple of reasons.
Such as?
First, you have censored data. Some lawsuits in the sample might still be ongoing when the data collection ends. OLS can't handle that properly. Hazard models are designed for this survival analysis. Second, the probability of settling isn't necessarily constant over time. It might increase as discovery progresses or decrease if new obstacles arise.
The hazard rate can change.
Exactly. The Cox model estimates this hazard rate, the instantaneous probability of settling at a given time, given that settlement hasn't happened yet, and allows the researchers to see how variables like DI lead affect that rate, controlling for other factors.
So it lets them test hypotheses about strategic timing. Do institutions speed things up or slow things down?
Precisely. It allows for a much more nuanced analysis of the litigation timeline than just looking at the average number of days to settlement.
All right, we've laid the groundwork, the theory, the design, the methods. Now for the payoff.
Okay.
Question 5. What were the major results, and how decisively do they answer that core research question about institutional effectiveness? Let's start with the immediate litigation outcomes, H1. Dismissal rates first.
The results here were really striking. Looking at hypothesis 1A, the coefficient on DI laid in the probate model was significantly negative.
Meaning institutions were less likely to see their cases dismissed.
Much less likely.
Yeah.
The paper calculates that the presence of an institutional laid plaintiff reduces the predicted probability of dismissal by about 38.2% compared to having an individual-led plaintiff, holding other factors constant.
38%, that's a huge reduction in risk for the plaintiffs.
It's enormous. And what's fascinating, as we discussed, is that this result held up even when they used the more rigorous two-stage estimation technique to control for endogeneity. That strongly suggests it's the institution's presence and effort that's making the difference, not just the fact they picked stronger cases.
Okay, lower dismissal risk. What about the money? Settlement size, H1B?
Equally dramatic, if not more so. The coefficient on Dion laid in the logged OLS settlement models was significantly positive.
How significant in dollar terms?
Interpreting the logged coefficient, their estimate suggests that having an institutional-led plaintiff increases the total settlement amount by approximately 59.8%, almost 60% larger settlements.
Wow. So if an average case might have settled for, say, $50 million with an individual lead.
Having an institution at the helm pushes that closer to $80 million on average, controlling for other case characteristics. Again, this is a massive economic effect. For defendant firms and their D&O insurers, this is a game changer.
Did the study break down which types of institutions had the biggest impact? You mentioned public pension funds earlier.
Yes, they did an institution-type decomposition.
Yeah.
And it was quite revealing. While pretty much all categories of institutional investors they looked at, union funds, mutual funds, banks, insurance companies were associated with significantly higher settlements than individual plaintiffs.
The public pension funds stood out.
They did. The coefficient for public pension funds, DPUB-PN, was the largest, indicating they achieved the biggest settlements on average. This fits with that idea we discussed about potential political motivations, or maybe just a stronger public mandate to be aggressive.
But importantly, it wasn't only the public funds driving the result.
Absolutely not. Other institutions were also clearly effective monitors in terms of securing larger financial recoveries.
Okay, let's shift to the long game. Subsequent governance reform, H2. What did they find regarding changes like board independence?
This, to me, is where the evidence for genuine monitoring impact becomes incredibly compelling. They found clear evidence that lawsuits led by institutions resulted in significantly greater improvements in board independence compared to lawsuits led by individuals.
Can you give us the key number again, that data nugget?
Sure. Looking at the change from 1 year before the lawsuit filing, year 9 of 1, to 3 years after, year +3, firms with institutional-led plaintiffs saw their board independence increase by 11.70 percentage points, more than comparable non-sued firms in the control group.
And how did that compare to firms sued with individual-led plaintiffs?
Those firms showed basically no significant improvement relative to the control group, a near 0% change. The difference is stark.
So institutions aren't just getting more money, they're actively forcing structural changes to governance.
The evidence points strongly in that direction. They seem to be using the leverage of the lawsuit to demand and achieve reforms aimed at preventing future problems.
Did they see which aspect of independence changed most?
Yes, the most significant improvement was in the percentage of independent directors on the full board. And consistent with the settlement findings, public pension funds appeared to be particularly strong drivers of this governance improvement.
Which aligns perfectly with that long-term holder incentive theory, right? They want to fix the company because they're likely stuck holding the shares.
Exactly. It supports the idea that for these types of investors, achieving meaningful governance reform is a primary objective, perhaps sometimes even more important than maximizing the immediate cash settlement.
So let's step back. What's the overall verdict on the research question based on these results?
The verdict seems overwhelmingly clear. Yes. The major results strongly support the central hypothesis. Institutional investors, when they act as lead plaintiffs under the PSLRA framework, are demonstrably more effective monitors than individual plaintiffs.
Across the board.
Across the board. They achieve better immediate litigation outcomes, lower dismissal rates, significantly higher financial settlements, and they are associated with substantially greater improvements in corporate governance down the line. The evidence suggests the PSLRA's goal of empowering sophisticated investors largely succeeded.
All right, final analytical question. We've seen the results. Now, question 6. What specific conclusions did Cheng and colleagues draw from their findings? And crucially, do you think these conclusions are fully warranted based on the underlying theory, the research design, and the econometric methods we've painstakingly detailed?
Okay, let's look at their main conclusions. Conclusion 1 is essentially that securities litigation is a viable and effective channel for institutional investors to exercise their monitoring power over corporations.
Warranted.
I'd say absolutely warranted. The results, particularly the robustness to the controls for self-selection and the instrumental variable analysis, strongly support the idea that the observed effects are causal, driven by the institution's actions, not just correlations.
Okay. Conclusion 2 kind of summarizes the key findings. Institutional involvement leads to better outcomes, both financially, lower dismissal, higher settlements, and in terms of governance, quality board independence.
Again, fully warranted. This flows directly from the significant results we just discussed for hypotheses H1A, H1B, and H2. The evidence for both immediate litigation success and subsequent governance improvement is compelling, especially given the careful design comparing outcomes to individual plaintiffs and controlling for market trends.
Now, conclusion 3 is maybe the most nuanced, drawing on that hazard model analysis of timing. What did they conclude there?
Conclusion 3 is about strategic behavior. They conclude that institutional-led plaintiffs don't just passively litigate. They actively and strategically manage the settlement timeline.
How so?
They found evidence that institutions manage to achieve those larger settlements in a comparatively shorter time frame than it takes individuals to achieve settlements of similar magnitude when controlling for case factors. This suggests efficiency.
But it wasn't just about speed, was it? Didn't they find evidence of tailoring the strategy?
Yes, and this is where it gets really interesting for practitioners. They found institutions tend to expedite settlements settle faster in certain situations. For instance, when the alleged fraud occurred over a longer class period, LCICS, maybe indicating complexity they want resolved sooner, or when suing firms in regulated industries, REG, or the tech sector, tech, perhaps reflecting a desire for quicker certainty in fast-moving or heavily scrutinized environments.
But they slow down sometimes, too.
Conversely, yes. They found institutions tend to prolong the litigation when the defendant firm is more profitable. The likely interpretation is they see a richer defendant as having a greater capacity to pay, making it worthwhile to hold out longer for a potentially larger settlement.
So, is this conclusion about strategic time management warranted?
I think it's well supported by their hazard model results. It paints a picture of institutions not just as powerful litigants, but as sophisticated strategic actors who tailor their approach based on the specific characteristics of the case and the defendant firm.
Okay, let's revisit some nuances in critical analysis. We talked about public funds getting the biggest settlements, possibly due to politics. But does the paper suggest the overall monitoring effect is just political grandstanding?
No, I don't think the evidence supports that narrow view. While the largest settlement effect for public funds aligns with political benefit theories, the fact that other institutions, unions, mutual funds, etc., also significantly reduce dismissal rates and drive governance reform suggests the core mechanism is broader.
It's more about the capacity and incentives that come with being a large, sophisticated stakeholder.
Exactly. The results suggest the monitoring effectiveness is a more general feature of institutional capacity, resources, and long-term perspective, not solely driven by the unique political environment of public funds.
And what about the interaction between the institution's presence and the seriousness of the alleged misconduct?
That's another important nuance. The authors find that firms do tend to improve governance somewhat when faced with really serious allegations, like major accounting fraud, DBIAC, ACTFURM, regardless of who the plaintiff is. The reputational hit forces some change.
But the institution adds something on top.
Yes. Having an institutional-led plaintiff acts like an accelerant or an amplifier. It significantly compounds the pressure for reform, pushing the firm further and faster towards improving board independence than they likely would have if facing only an individual plaintiff, even with the same serious allegations. It underscores the institution's unique leverage. So, pulling it all together, what this deep dive really reinforces is a major theme in corporate governance over the last few decades: the growing power and influence of institutional investors.
And specifically, their willingness to use legal channels when quieter methods fail.
Exactly. This study shifts the conversation. It's less about if institutions monitor and more about how effectively they monitor, particularly when they deploy this very public, very potent tool of litigation.
It also serves as a strong validation of the PSLRA's core premise, doesn't it?
It really does. It underscores the importance of that legislative shift, substituting sophisticated, motivated parties for potentially passive individual plaintiffs who might have been more easily influenced by class counsel's incentives. It seems the law largely achieved what it set out to do in that respect.
Okay, so given this strong foundation, where does research go next? What future research questions does a paper like this inspire?
Well, one obvious area, which the authors themselves touch upon, relates to the strategy of opting out.
Meaning institutions choosing not to be part of the class action at all.
Right. We know, often anecdotally, that sometimes very large institutions with huge losses choose to opt out of the class settlement and pursue their own individual lawsuit against the company. The theory is they might get a much larger recovery that way, since they don't have to share it with thousands of other class members or pay the class counsel fees.
So the question is opting out actually a more effective monitoring strategy than leading the class action?
That's the key question. Does it lead to bigger financial recoveries per dollar lost? Does it result in different, maybe even stronger governance concessions? We need more systematic empirical comparisons between the outcomes of opt-out cases versus institution-led class actions. That's a big gap.
Makes sense. What else?
The other major area reflects changes in the market since this paper was published in 2010. Specifically, the rise of hedge funds as major players in shareholder activism.
Does that fit in?
Well, the original study lumped hedge funds into a general other institutions category. But we know now that activist hedge funds often have very different strategies and time horizons compared to, say, pension funds.
They might be more focused on short-term gains.
Often, yes. So the research question becomes, do hedge funds use securities litigation as a tool, perhaps alongside their other activist tactics? If so, how do their objectives and outcomes compare to traditional long-term investors like pension funds?
Do they push as hard for governance reform? Or are they more focused on maximizing a quick cash settlement to boost their funds' returns?
Exactly. Understanding how different types of institutions with potentially different incentives leverage litigation is a really important area for future work. The authors flagged hedge funds as an interesting avenue back in 2010, and it's only become more relevant since. #outro. So, to really synthesize what we've discussed today, this deep dive into Cheng et al.'s work reveals something fundamental. When a major institutional investor makes the decision to step up and serve as lead plaintiff, it fundamentally changes the nature of that litigation.
It's not just about the money anymore.
It's not just a punitive financial event. It transforms into something more profound, a mandate, often backed by significant legal and financial muscle for structural governance change. This paper provides powerful confirmation that institutional capacity and incentives really do translate into superior legal and governance outcomes.
Okay, let's really unpack the final implication here. If we accept this evidence that an institutional lead plaintiff is proven so effective not just at getting money back, but at genuinely improving how a company is run long-term, then should boards, maybe even proactively, think about the risk of attracting an institutional-led lawsuit differently, not just as a liability to be minimized, but almost as a, well, perhaps a very costly but potentially effective external mechanism for demonstrating or even achieving a commitment to long-term shareholder value and better risk management.
It's a really provocative thought. Could facing or even anticipating such a suit become a catalyst for reforms that maybe should have happened anyway?
Right. Is there a strategic element for the board in how they respond beyond just defense? Something for you, our listeners, to definitely mull over as you think about applying these insights in your own work, whether it's research or practice.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into institutional power plays and shareholder litigation.
We'll catch you on the next deep dive.
Thanks for tuning into the Lion's Share podcast. If you enjoyed today's discussion, share it with a friend and join us next time for more ideas worth talking about. We'll see you next time.